Hi, everyone. I'm Mark Asselstine. I work with Wind River for almost 16 years now. And this is a slightly modified version of a talk I did at the Open Source Summit in Dublin. Apologies for anyone that was at that talk and is here now. If you want, now's the time to take your leave. But if you want to hear the differences, then feel free to hang on and ask me questions at the end. This is just a quick synopsis. It'll be in the slide deck after I update the latest slides at the end of the presentation on the site. And this is the agenda for today. As the title suggests, I'm going to be talking about software in the automotive industry. Obviously, this can apply to any devices that exist that have requirements for long-term support. But again, I'll be leaning towards the automotive side. Unlike a lot of the talks at the summit, I don't have too much hands-on because we're at the beginning of this journey, or at least our organization and myself are at the beginning of this journey. So I hope in the years to come to be able to present more hands-on and updates as to what's going on in this area, at least where I have visibility. But yeah, I'm going to start talking about the cell phone because it's a natural place to start for devices that are becoming more digital. I'm then going to move over to talk about where the automotive industry is in general today. There are some people that are leading, but just in general, where things are at. Next, I'm going to speak to the challenges of sustaining software for long periods of time, and then cover strategies and approaches that might be used to ease this support burden. And then finally, I'm going to go into some conclusions. So if we start with the cell phone, I think most of us are old enough here to remember phones when they look like this. Most of us that had a phone, a feature phone, we weren't too worried about software updates. There was no massive concern about security breaches. There's probably a few people that did do software updates. It was rather cumbersome. You typically needed to have third-party software installed most of the time on Windows, and you'd fetch a binary from the vendor and then run through a process with a special cable in order to get the software updated. But for the most part, the phone that you bought was the same as the phone that you threw out at the end of its life. Moving on to the smartphone, things were much different. The phone that was shipped that you bought evolved over the life of that phone. It essentially was given new value and new features via software updates, and included in the value is security updates. So often, I apologize if I sometimes intermix security and features and other value. I see them all as being important. So sometimes I'll say CVEs or security fixes, and other times I might just say value or features. But essentially, your smartphone, when you bought it, came with a set of features. Over the life of the phone, those features evolved over time. You installed new games, new applications, new software updates, and the phone that you threw out, even though it had the same physical characteristics as the phone you bought, it tended not to be the exact same thing when you threw it out based on your use of that phone. So even though you had two devices that essentially served the same purpose, moving from a feature phone to the smartphone was a huge step up in software and the software being deployed on your devices. Now, one of the aspects of updating software, as I sort of alluded to, was security. And as you can see in this chart from NIST, basically, when you release a product, the software on it, as much as you try to make sure it has no security issues, will have security issues. Two aspects to this chart, which are kind of interesting that I'll just touch on. One is the jump in CVEs reported in the year 2017. There's lots of speculation as to what caused this jump, but no one actually has been able to definitively say what precipitated that jump. And the other aspect being that even though the CVEs will cover a broad range of software, not all your devices will incorporate every piece of software that's being reported. You're going to have a fraction of those CVEs on your devices. And again, that will be on the date that it's shipped, because CVEs are reported sometime after the CVE already exists in the software. Now, if you're trying to look at the cell phone for how long a device might remain in use, it's difficult because there's lots of reasons why people update their phones. They might drop it and break their screen. They might have new connectivity options that they want to take advantage of, such as 5G, new features like folding. Their batteries might not be useful anymore, or they might want the latest SoC. So it's difficult to figure out with phones what exactly is the determining factor for doing an upgrade. There are some studies that looked at duration of how long somebody keeps a phone for Android as well as for Apple. And the range is anywhere from 2 to 5 years for the most part. Beyond that is fairly rare. So unfortunately, the phone is a good analog for devices going digital, but due to their fairly limited lifespan, it's not a perfect example, as we'll see in a few minutes. So here's the chart for iPhone, and again, you can see here, slightly better than Android. I think one of the longest running iPhones, I think it's the iPhone 10, has been updated for 8 years. But that's about the most you're going to get. So even if you use that best case scenario of 8 years, when you're looking at the automotive industry, that's still a fraction of what we actually need to support the software for. So let's take a quick look at where we are with the automotive industry. So this is actually a personal example. So my car had some issues, and I was mailed this recall notice. And as you can see in the notice, it basically says Hyundai will perform the software update to the ECU in your vehicle. So this essentially, similar to the feature phone, requires me to take the car into the dealer for them to have somebody actually open up the hood, plug in a cable, and run software, most likely on Windows, in order to update my car. So similar to the feature phone, cars are generally, most of the fleet that's out there still is in this sort of position where software updates can happen, but they tend to be rare. They tend to be difficult to actually follow through with software updates. Interesting enough, they actually ended up having to replace my engine on this one. So car companies are in that process of changing from making a car, selling it, waiting till eventually it rusts out or the engine stops working, and then trying to sell another one 10 or 15 years later. Instead, automotive industry or vehicles are being developed as digital devices. This comes with it the ability to update and beam new features and services to add value to the vehicle after it's sold, to make it either more useful or more fun to use. And this isn't just speculation. Ford itself has, this is slightly old, but Ford expected to sell 1 million vehicles capable of receiving over-the-air updates as at the end of the year. And this is actually dated back to 2021. And I believe they did achieve that goal. Ford also announced recently that their in-vehicle technology stack will allow for fully connected software updates. So again, to have that ability to provide additional value to customers after the car is shipped. So if we look again at this CVE chart, we know that cars are going to be shipped with software or have their software updated, and they're going to include things like security vulnerabilities that need to be addressed. Now, in the automotive industry, you end up having to look at CVEs differently than you would for other industries. So if we look at a typical CVE and we apply that same CVE to different industries, we'll see different truths. So if your device is monitoring your temperature and humidity in your house, then a CVE is not going to cause any critical issues. However, if that same CVE is found in your banking software where you might lose some money, but chances are the bank might even have insurance or other mechanisms to replace your money so you don't actually notice, and your bank just handles the security breach in a way that nobody gets injured. That same CV in a car could end up causing personal injury. So CVs basically, the same CV can have multiple outcomes depending on the device that you're actually working with. So if we look at the lifespan of a typical car, this data is from the EU because I originally wrote this presentation for it to be delivered in a European country. So if we look at the automobiles, the typical lifespan of the current fleet in Europe is 11.8 years. For vans, it's 11.9 years. And for commercial vehicles, it's 14.1 years. So again, looking back at the lifespan of a phone and how software updates are handled in phones, it's only a fraction of the time that we need to look at keeping software up to date in the vehicle market. So let's take a look at some of the challenges involved with maintaining and sustaining software for these typically long durations. So just like when you're developing the software in the first place, you need to make sure that all of these apply for the software for the duration of the vehicle. So it must be safe, must be secure, must have long-term support. Again, if we look at CVEs, they're going to constantly be coming up. And in order to get them fixed, we have to support that software long-term. We also have the added complexity that we need to deliver new features and services. So we basically have to add value to our vehicles. We see this with Tesla, with full self-drive, for instance. There's constantly a new revision of full self-drive, and Tesla customers that want to get access to that end up paying a fee in order to continually get those updates. Must run on a diversity of hardware. So if you think that producing software for a single vehicle is challenging enough, try to do that over multiple generations of a vehicle, where you might have to have the same software target an old ARM chip as well as a new ARM chip. Do you want that software to be completely forked in order to do that, or is it better to have a single stack and deal with the differences in hardware using other mechanisms? Will be composed from a large ecosystem. I try not to mention Tesla too much in this talk because Tesla has a habit of doing everything in a very vertical fashion, where everything is owned by Tesla. But if you go beyond Tesla, so Ford and GM or other incumbent car manufacturers, they tend to have ecosystems to support their automotive development. And so software is going to be coming from a large ecosystem, not just a single vendor in most cases. And then the lack of precedence. Again, the phone is a precedent, but it's not a perfect precedent. So some of this is going to have to be thought out and worked out as the automotive industry moves into this digital world. Now, if you look at any one of these, it tends to be fairly, there are solutions for each of them. Like if you look at safety, for instance, or security, there's already solutions out there, such as using hypervisors and VMs, where the hypervisor might be certified and Linux is able to run in an enclave in which it can't cause any problems. But one of the challenging ones is must have long-term support. So listening to Anna's presentation earlier, as she mentioned, developing embedded software is hard. I think it's just as hard once it's developed to keep it supported and maintained over the long term. And some of the challenges that are related to that are you end up splitting up your teams. So you'll have sustaining teams as well as your development or growth teams. And in that case, sustaining over time is going to get more and more releases put on them, while the development team is pushing ahead with adding new features and functionality. You also have open source software projects and releases being EOL'd. Obviously, a release being EOL'd is easier to absorb than a full project disappearing. But both of them can equally cause a disruption in your software development and your ability to support it long term. There's different open source software release models. So there's sort of the branch model, like the Linux kernel, where a sustaining team essentially takes on the work of maintaining that kernel over a longer period of time than each release itself. So basically, Greg Cage and his team is maintaining 5.15 over a period of 2 years or 4 years, and you can use that branch for that duration, knowing that there's CVEs and other bug fixes are being handled. And then you also have the channeled model, such as Chromium, where there's only ever one release that's the latest and the recommended. And you pretty much need to track Chromium releases, not having the ability to set yourself on a single release for any period of time. And then there's also value shifting, which is one of the biggest challenges. And we see this in phones, where essentially a manufacturer eventually gets to a tipping point where they realize that rather than maintaining a piece of software or device over a longer period of time, it's more profitable for them to sell a new device and ship new software on that and start neglecting the old one. That's what we want to avoid. So some of the strategies and approaches to enabling frequent and sustained software updates. So again, some of these are going to be repeats from some of the other talks, but having a robust and reliable software update framework, such as RAUC and SW Update, are obviously important to being able to do software updates. Without some sort of update framework, it's very difficult to do, to maintain a piece of software or device that's in the wild, let alone driving around the world. Both of these are open source, and they both have open embedded or Yocto project layers, and can easily be explored for your software projects for being able to do deployments and OTA updates on your devices. Alongside these, kind of a bit lower down on the chain, are image management and creation tools. OSTree, which is available in Meta Open Embedded, provides a way for you to maintain and control, have version control essentially over your root file system. Wind River's also made available what we call the Linux assembly tool. The Linux assembly tool allows you to use your artifacts from your Yocto project builds to assemble images. And these images can either be root file systems or containers or other elements, such as things that you might want to use with systemd portable services. It actually, depending on how you use the Linux assembly tool, it does wrap the WIC image generation tool, but it basically allows you to define how your system should be assembled, and it works with OSTree. So you can use the Linux assembly tool in order to generate an image. You can deploy that to your device. If you're missing a piece of software, you can add that to your definition, your YAML file in the Linux assembly tool, and then respin a new image, which adds a new OSTree commit that then you can pull from the device in order to have basically multiple generations of root file system on your device. Now, software update and image manipulation or maintenance tools aren't going to be enough to sustain software in the long term. One of the big challenges is designing and building for change. Change can come in many forms, change in requirements, goals, build environment, for instance, software and hardware components. So again, open source software often has versions go EOL or even whole projects go EOL. That could be a change that you have to adapt around. And change can also ensure health and viability of your project. So basically, if you are writing software for a device and you recognize that certain aspects of that software are doing things like eating up lots of battery, you might have to change that software to be less CPU intensive and extend the life of the device. Now, designing for change, you do have to plan for the change early in the design. So it's one of the first things that you should be doing is evaluating your device and figuring out what might possibly change. So for instance, again, with cars being produced a new model every 2 years, let's say, you're pretty much assured that your SoC is going to be changing every 2 years. So having some sort of hardware abstraction would probably be a good choice to help you design for that change. And when you identify that change, the next thing to do is isolate, so that when you do have to absorb or make use of a new SoC, that the amount of software that you're changing to support those new part numbers is going to be minimal. Probably one of the biggest things is that change is going to happen. It's unavoidable. So as much planning as you do, you're still going to have to face change at some point. And when that does happen, the best you can do is hope that your environment and your tooling is able to assist as best as it can to absorb that change. Probably one of the biggest ones here is software written years from now should be able to be run on cars sold today. And basically what I'm trying to say there is that if you're looking at something like mapping software, that software might change dramatically in 4 years. Let's say it has better pathfinding or better ways to display map data. You shouldn't be limited in that software only being able to run on cars developed 5 years from now. Ideally, you want that same software to be able to run on cars sold today. And this means that you're not sustaining software over the full life of the car. What you're doing is being able to deploy software to that car that matches the latest state of the art. Now, again, this isn't always possible. There are going to be hardware limitations. But what you can do is have the software have modes where you can have it run on a SoC that's not as powerful as one that might be released 5 years from now. Some other tactics to make use of, and Yocto does a very good job in this, in providing libraries and other tooling which map to known standards. So things like the kernel ABI or more rigid things like POSIX. The Yocto project offers a lot of different RPC and messaging systems, and the community tends to coalesce around those that have the most viability and the most chance of still being used 5 or 10 years from now. External configurations. So again, this comes in when you have software that might have to be run differently on an older device versus a newer device. Ideally, when you build your software, it should have the capability in it to run on both, but the way that you configure it is using an external configuration. It's easy to change a configuration file. It's not so easy to change the software itself. Templates and observer patterns and exploiting language capabilities. So again, these are things that tend to have a little bit longer lifespan. So language bindings tend not to disappear after only a few years, but tend to have a long lifespan. Now, the other aspect that I've been looking into more and more is declarative systems. A lot of you might have heard about NixOS, which is a fairly talked about declarative systems. Basically, you're defining your system by code, and you're also really not defining the initial state, but your expected state of the system. Yocto has a lot of aspects of a declarative system, but I think there's some things missing, and I actually want to explore looking at ways to make uh, Yocto project capable of being more of a declarative system without changing, the way it's currently set up. It would be more of an enhancement. Um, with declarative systems, they're very reproducible with minimal change. You should be able to build these things over and over again and tracking everything that will be changed. Um, minimizes update bandwidth. Again, your declarative system should be a fairly minimal system, and therefore only things that you're changing or uh, things that are being changed due to updates of versions, for instance, are going to cause there to be an update and therefore size increase on your update. It already helps isolate your hardware or other changes, and it eases rollback because your declarative system, again, it's defined by code. You're going to have that code committed into some sort of SCM, and you'll be able to track your changes. Unlike right now, for instance, with local.conf, those changes to local.conf are often not being tracked. So this is an area, again, that I think we can expand Yocto project, or even it doesn't necessarily have to be part of Yocto project, to look at making it work with a common declarative system language, for instance. So on to conclusions. So vehicles and devices in general are becoming more and more like digital devices. Digital devices in their nature require updates to remain safe and secure and to deliver new features and services. We don't want software defining the lifespan of a vehicle or devices. And software written years from now should be able to run on vehicles shipped today. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. Again, I don't have much as far as being able to do hands-on. That will come hopefully in the next few years. This project that I'm involved in right now with one of our partners is something that I anticipate to go on for quite some time, and I hope to be able to have future presentations to show some of the areas where we've taken some of these things and actually put them into practice.